Good day. Today is Friday, 22nd November. As it happens, today is the last day of my trip to Budapest. I am returning to London tomorrow. So this will be the last of these programs happening in the conditions which have prevailed over the last couple of days when I have been making programs here. And of necessity, because I'm again going from one meeting to the other, this is going to be a shorter program than my usual programs. So my apologies, my thanks to you, all of you who have been watching these programs, for sticking with me throughout this 5 days, this extraordinary 5 days. And can I also say that it'll be, well, perhaps not quite business as normal tomorrow, because obviously I have to travel back to London and I'll probably be tired after my journey. So conceivably my program again will be a little shorter. But anyway, business as usual fairly soon. Let's turn to the news. Let's turn to the events of the last 24 hours. And they have been dramatic 24 hours. Now, the first thing to say is that we are still in that period directly after the Russian missile strike on the Yuzhmash factory, the gigantic Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro, by the new, or perhaps not so new, Russian missile system, the Oreshnik, which, for the record, appears to translate as Hazel. Very typical designation, Russian designation for an advanced missile, just so. Anyway, there has been a very in-depth, very interesting analysis, both of the attack by the Oreshnik on the Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro and of the preceding Ukrainian, British, American attack with Storm Shadow and HIMARS missiles in Kursk region by Simplicius the Thinker on his Substack. Now, I'm going to just touch on a number of things that Simplicius the Thinker has said, and I'm just going to add a few observations of my own. Now, in relation to the attack in Kursk, Simplicius the Thinker has explained why it would have been difficult for the Russians to shoot down all the Storm Shadow missiles. It would be unlikely that the Russians would deploy advanced radars and S-400 missiles in the Kursk pocket itself. It is now relatively small, and any such advanced equipment would be a potential target for Ukrainian drones, suicide drones. So one of the reasons why a command post in Kursk region apparently was targeted with these missiles was precisely because the Russians do not have air defense assets, or at least their most powerful air defense assets in Kursk region itself, but some way to the east, and that enables the Storm Shadows to approach the target a little closer. And Simplicius the Thinker also believes that the command post that the Ukrainians sought to attack, which President Putin of Russia has informed us was undamaged, is unlikely to have been a particularly important command post, probably one that functioned at battalion level or even lower, because it is most unlikely, indeed extremely improbable, that the Russians would operate a significant command post, one with the command staff at brigade level or above, so close to the front lines. Now, I am not familiar with the layout of command posts or the way in which they are emplaced on battlefields. What I am going to say is this. Over the last couple of hours, the Russian Defense Ministry has disclosed that the Russian Defense Minister, Andrei Belousov, has actually visited Kursk region, where he met with the commander of Group of Forces North, General Alexander Lapin, and his staff in a command post, and where Belousov was briefed by Lapin and was provided with a tour of inspection of captured Western equipment. Now, if one follows the logic of what Simplicius the thinker says, probably, most likely, this command post, this big command post, the post of the entire group of forces, must have been located some distance from the Kursk pocket itself, conceivably, in fact, most probably, in the city of Kursk itself. I mean, that would be logical. Having said that, it is something of a coincidence, at least interesting to me, that this visit happened at approximately the same time that the Western powers and the Ukrainians were conducting missile strikes against a command post in Kursk region. Now, it may be the case that the two events are completely unconnected with each other. It is also possible that the visit by Belousov to the headquarters of Group of Forces North took place, or at least the command post of Group of Forces North. Interestingly, the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't say it was the actual headquarters. Anyway, it is possible that this visit took place after the missile strike took place, though in that case, I would have expected some mention of the missile strike in the Defense Ministry's report of this visit. I wonder, this is just a thought, it's just speculation on my part, I may be completely wrong here. I wonder whether Western intelligence got some information that Belousov was traveling to Kursk region. He has, after all, been visiting the front lines fairly often, visiting important headquarters fairly often. I would have thought it would be not particularly difficult to work out in advance his travel arrangements. I mean, I doubt that these are deeply classified. The Western powers, the Ukrainians, might have known that he was heading in the direction of Kursk region. They might have known that he was going to visit a command post there. They might have assumed that he would be visiting the command post that was attacked, even though, and I'm not disputing what Simplicius the thinker says, this was apparently a relatively small command post in a small village. Now, the reason why I wonder whether the two events might be connected is because of what I said in the program I did in which I discussed this attack. Allegedly, 12 expensive, basically irreplaceable Storm Shadow missiles were used to attack one village. The Ukrainians have admitted to apparently 10 of these missiles, and it's been suggested that there might have been 2 more. We also learned that HIMARS rockets were also used in this attack. This seems to me incredible overkill, even to attack, well, especially to attack a battalion or company headquarters. And I wonder whether there was some idea, possibly, that the Russian defense minister would be going maybe with the commander of the entire group of forces, General Lapin, to inspect the forces on the front line, and that the attack was intended basically to get him. Now, that's a guess. I'm not going to insist on it. There are lots of reports and rumors circulating that North Korean generals were killed in this strike. That's now been walked back. It was then said that a single North Korean general was killed in this strike. That too has been walked back. He's supposed now to have been merely wounded. be surprising that a general would be present at a battalion command post. It again doesn't seem to be very logical. But I wonder whether the Ukrainians, the British, the Americans, who perhaps are not very familiar with the actual granular detail of Russian movements and movements of Russian officials, put two and two together, came to the wrong conclusion, thought that the defense minister was there, and that was why they conducted the strike on this small command post in this overwhelming way, even though Putin tells us, and I've no reason to doubt him, that the attack actually in the end failed. Some perimeter guards and personnel were injured and killed, but the command post itself and its personnel were unaffected. Anyway, that's a guess. If this was a command strike, if it was an attempt to kill the Russian defense minister and the commander of Group of Forces North, well, that would have been an even more extreme escalation. And it might explain, by the way, the intensity of the Russian reaction. Anyway, I don't want to push all of this because, again, I'm guessing at the extreme end of the envelope. But bear in mind that the Ukrainians have in the past openly admitted that they have attempted assassination attempts on President Putin. Kirill Budanov, the military intelligence chief, has said as much. And the Ukrainians have made many claims about their successful killing of senior Russian military officers, and indeed a Russian naval officer, senior naval officer, was assassinated almost certainly by the Ukrainians just about a week ago. So it would not be out of character, though it would be very, very disturbing indeed if the American and British governments were involved in executing something like this. So anyway, I don't want to press further on this. Let's move on to the Oreshnik strike. And again, Simplikis, the thinker, has a great deal to say about the Oreshnik strike. He explains, or at least he discusses, the kind of missile that we might be talking about. He suggests that it might be a development of the Rubezh intermediate range ballistic missile, which is itself related to the Topol and Yars series of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The key point that I took from this long article by him, which, by the way, I think is fairly definitive, is that the attack on the Yuzhmash plant involved multiple warheads launched by this missile, each of which is capable of independent maneuver and can attack different targets. So apparently we had six sub-missiles launched by the main missile, 6 warheads, and each of these warheads had apparently 3 further devices. And there is no doubt at all, in fact, it is universally acknowledged that the missile itself, the Oreshnik, was moving at hypersonic speeds, at least 10 times the speed of sound. Some people think it was moving faster, and that the warheads, as they maneuvered and struck the Yuzhmash facility, they were also moving at high hypersonic speeds, right immediately before the point of impact. In this, of course, this strike differs from the Kinjal missile, which reduces from hypersonic speed to supersonic speed in the minutes or seconds before impact, something which could theoretically make it vulnerable to interception. This particular missile and its warheads cannot be intercepted with any existing technology or with any technology that is likely to appear in service anywhere in the world at any point in the next few years, just to say. So, a massive strike involving an extremely advanced system. There's a lot of debate about whether these warheads carried explosives or not. Some suggest that these were purely kinetic strikes using these warheads intended to demonstrate the capability, that in the event that warheads were used, they would be nuclear warheads. So this is an attack intended to demonstrate the capability, and an awesome capability it has turned out to be. Now, a couple of weeks ago, about 6 weeks ago, Professor Glenn Deason and I did an interview, a live stream, not an live stream, an interview, which has appeared on the Duran with Professor Theodore Postol, in which he discussed how the deployment of American hypersonic weapons in Germany would be potentially incredibly dangerous for the Russians, because their radar and satellite systems would give them a very, very short warning time in the event that these missiles were to be launched against Russia and were to try to conduct an attack against Russia. It has been suggested, and I have no reason to dispute this, that this particular system that has just been activated is in some respects, the Russian system, the Oreshnik, is in some respects a Russian analog, in the sense that it moves at speeds which reduce reaction times anywhere in Europe to extremely short periods, roughly 15 minutes, which is about the same as the American missiles if they were to strike at Moscow. And that, again, even if the Americans were able to track and identify their launch, there is simply no way of intercepting these systems. And in the 15 minutes available, there would be insufficient time to work out any kind of countermeasures. Well, if that is correct, then we can see that the arms race in Europe is already taking an extremely dangerous turn, with missiles being operated by each side that are capable of devastating attacks upon the other, and also, and further, that the Russians have a capability to attack targets anywhere in Europe, anywhere on the European continent with this kind of missile, using these kind of warheads, whether conventional or nuclear, and that there is no defense to them. So this is something that Western governments need to consider. I ought to say that some years ago, I learnt of a Russian program to develop a new submarine, new nuclear-powered submarine called the Laika. And this submarine is apparently intended to be equipped with medium-ranged missiles that carry warheads, maneuverable warheads, similar to the one that has been demonstrated, that has just been demonstrated. And I wonder whether this is an actual program, this is a significant program, and whether the missile that has been used is in fact a missile that is being developed for installation in this submarine. Submarine is still in the process of being designed, in which case, of course, it could operate in the Atlantic or wherever and would be able to target the east coast of the United States. Now, again, I don't want to go into too much speculation here. Suffice to say, the realities by themselves are alarming enough. They show that reaction times are being reduced. And in terms of the Ukrainian conflict, well, President Putin has demonstrated that he does have the capability to attack targets anywhere in Europe, that the claim that the Russians made, they originally gave this warning to the British ambassador, as I remember, some months ago. I believe it was in spring, that if the British did conduct or help the Ukrainians to conduct missile strikes on Russia, the Russians could reserve to themselves the right to attack weapons installations, military infrastructure in Britain itself. Well, President Putin has demonstrated that the Russians, in fact, most definitely do have that capability. They wouldn't just use systems like the Kinzhal and the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile, but one with only a relatively small warhead. They could use this utterly devastating weapon, which even when used as a conventional weapon would do, or could potentially do, tremendous damage. Now, I say that there is a significant amount of footage which has been released, I don't know by whom, by the way, of the strike on the Yuzhmash factory, and it makes an absolutely terrifying and awesome spectacle. I'm not going to try and judge the effect of this strike or the intended effect of this strike or what it was intended to achieve. No doubt we'll get more information when the satellite pictures begin to appear. But the strike itself was an absolutely awesome affair. And note that it will not be affected by weather conditions or anything of that kind when using technology like this. So I get the sense that this event, this use of this missile, has provoked significant alarm across Europe. Chancellor Scholz of Germany has spoken about it as an escalation. So, of course, has President Zelensky. Other officials around Europe and in the United States have done the same. The US said that they had detected the preparations for the Russian strike, for the missile strike. It now seems that they were provided with information of this missile strike by the Russians themselves, apparently just a few minutes before it took place. The reason for that would have been that the Russians would want to make sure that the Americans were aware in advance that this missile was not carrying nuclear weapons. If the Americans were in doubt about that, then they might have reacted by launching nuclear weapons of their own against Russia, in which case we could be in a nuclear war situation. Already that tells us how dangerous the situation has become. And I'm going to guess that the Russians had previously given advice to foreign embassies, to the foreign governments, friendly governments around the world, that a system of this kind was about to be used. In fact, the Speaker of the Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, I understand, said about 2 days ago that the Russians might respond to the American and to the ATACMS and Storm Shadow strikes by using weapons of a new capability. Anyway, I wonder, and I'm going to guess, that the Russians tipped off friendly governments that a major strike of this kind was about to take place and told them to make sure that their nationals had been warned to stay away from potential military targets. And, well, that might have led to the alarm about the embassies, which resulted in the embassies in Kiev closing before it became clear that the strike would not be against Kiev itself, but against this gigantic factory in Dnipro. That there is alarm in the West is confirmed by two things. Firstly, these various articles and commentaries that are appearing across the West telling us about how the Russians are now escalating. I have to say, I find this beyond bizarre. Scholz has spoken like this. I've read articles in the Financial Times, in The Guardian as well, telling us that the Russians are escalating. How are the Russians not escalating, given the fact that we escalated immediately prior to the action that they have taken by escalating us ourselves? The Russians had not escalated. We would have said, I can already read the articles, that all the warnings from Putin, all the comments that he had made over the last couple of months were empty bluff. So we took the step of escalating with direct attacks on Russian territory, something which, to repeat again, has never happened at any time before. It never happened at any time during any of the regional conflicts that the superpowers waged against each other during the Cold War. At no time did either of the two superpowers, the United States or the Soviet Union, conduct attacks on each other's territories. So we took that dramatic escalatory step despite Russian warnings of assisting Ukraine to conduct a strike on Russia. And as night follows day, the Russians have escalated in return, though it must be said, still in a more moderate and measured way than we have done. They have chosen their target in Ukraine itself, even as they have the ability, as they have pointed out to us, to conduct strikes on our territories as well. And they've also made it clear that they reserve the right to do so. So, yes, we are in a cycle of escalation, but it is a cycle that we have brought on ourselves. Anyway, there are now hurried consultations. NATO is apparently due to have a meeting on the 26th of November. There are apparently already hysterical proposals, and I do consider them to be utterly hysterical proposals, that the time might have come to supply nuclear weapons to Ukraine, given that Ukraine became a victim of Russian aggression, notwithstanding the so-called Budapest memorandum. This has been discussed exhaustively in many places. The whole story of Ukraine parting with nuclear weapons in return for security guarantees is a complete myth. It never had nuclear weapons to start with, and the demand that it give up the nuclear weapons that were stationed in its territory, or at least allow them to be returned to Russia, was insisted on at the time by, amongst other countries, the United States. I'm not going to revisit this whole complex topic in this program. But anyway, suffice to say that there is clear alarm and concern. Chancellor Scholz, even whilst he's criticizing the Russians of escalation, is now coming back and saying that he still refuses to supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine. He at least seems to have some understanding of how dangerous the situation has become. And of course, the proposal to supply Ukraine with nuclear weapons, if it is really being made, apparently there's been an article to that effect in the New York Times, though I have not myself seen it. Well, if that proposal really has been floated, I have to say I'm sure that 2 months until the inauguration of the next president is not sufficient time to do something like that. President Putin has already warned the transfer of nuclear weapons in that way to Ukraine would be noticed by Russian intelligence, and the Russians would take immediate action to stop it, to prevent it. And, well, suffice to say also that doing something like that would be the end of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is already on life support, and the collapse of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty would be disastrous for the global position of the United States. So I'm assuming that this is not going to happen, but apparently the fact that there is all this hysterical language, all these hysterical briefings and agonized concerns and furious statements, well, all of that tells us how alarmed and despondent and frightened the Western powers now are. And of course, frightened people are angry people. And as I've said previously in previous programs, decisions made in anger are almost guaranteed to be bad and are repented at leisure. So I hope that on this occasion, sane counsels finally prevail, that after the strikes that we have seen, the first ATACMS strikes and the first Storm Shadow strikes, both of which, just repeat again, have been a failure, a decision is now taken to row back, to at least consult with the president-elect and his forming national security team, and to stop this continued slide in escalation before something really does happen from which there is no return. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about this situation for the present time. Let me add further that the military situation in Ukraine continues to get worse for Ukraine every day. Now, to repeat what I said in my program yesterday, I am not able to keep fully on top of the recent military developments on the battlefronts. However, I did read that the Russians did indeed cross the Kurakovo Reservoir and were able to enter Kurakovo from the north. Apparently this was not done over the bridge from Novaya Ilinka. It was done by boat. There's a long discussion of this in Redovka, Russian newspaper. They've given a detailed account of how this operation took place. But the big story, and I mentioned the article in the BBC yesterday, the article that acknowledged that the Ukrainian defense lines are now within, well, perhaps not immediate threat of collapse, but coming ever closer to that point. That is what is ultimately driving this whole situation. There is desperation across the collective West. There is fear. There is anger. As I said, fear always leads to anger. That has led to reckless decisions like these missile strikes with the ATACMS and with the Storm Shadows. It's also what has produced these debates about transferring nuclear weapons. Here, whilst in Hungary, I was informed by someone who has a high-level position, I'm not going to say more than that, that this person has heard of discussions taking place amongst some European Union officials, again, I'm not going to say more than that, about possibly sending European troops to Ukraine. A crazy idea, which the Russians have warned they will react forcefully against. There is a bizarre article, I mean, I consider it bizarre, in the Financial Times, again about deploying a European peacekeeping force without the Americans in Ukraine. It seems to be recognized that the Russians would not agree to that, there doesn't seem to be any understanding that the Russians cannot be coerced into agreeing to this. This whole article appears to be premised on the idea that third parties, external powers, will somehow persuade the Russians to agree to this idea, which the Russians have emphatically rejected. The reality is that the escalatory moves that we have seen over the last couple of days have caused a further deterioration in the position of the West internationally. I'm now hearing some really extraordinary accounts about what happened during the G20 summit in Rio. Apparently, the Brazilians, to a great extent, catapulted the Western powers into agreeing to the wording in the final communique about Ukraine. It seems the French and the Germans were absolutely furious about this, and I've no doubt the Americans were as well. Notice that the Brazilians acted as they did after the media reports appeared about the American decision to greenlight missile strikes on Russia. So, world opinion is not moving towards putting pressure on the Russians. On the contrary, it is becoming increasingly antagonized by us. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, incidentally, in the hours after the Oreshnik attack on the Dnipro factory, published another statement saying that the situation called for calm, for level-headed decision-making, for steps to de-escalate the situation, which is, of course, what the Russians are also saying. It is in the West that these wise words need to be heeded. And anyone who thinks that by this point in the conflict, the global majority, which has refused to side with the West in pressuring Russia at any point in the conflict up to now, even at the start of the conflict, where their sympathies were far more with Ukraine than they are today. Anybody who still believes that is deluding themselves. So there we are. The only way out of this affair is through negotiations, through discussions with the Russians. The Russians, by the way, over the last couple of hours, have been at pains to say that they're still open for talks, that they're not going to shift from their red lines. And that is clearly the right way. After all, there were talks at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was those talks which made it possible to defuse that crisis. It is incredible that apart from this lone telephone call to President Putin by Olaf Scholz, a telephone call which appears to have achieved nothing of any importance, no proper discussions or talks between the Americans and the Russians, or between the Europeans and the Russians, are taking place. This situation, which we are in now, by the way, calls for, absolutely requires a telephone conversation between President Biden and President Putin to try to de-escalate the situation. Jeffrey Sachs has been pointing out for the last 3 years how the absence of contacts between the American and Russian presidents, one for which the Americans, by the way, appear to be solely to blame, is incredible in a situation of this kind. And, well, Perhaps, given President Biden's personality and his visceral feelings about President Putin and his extreme views, at least to me they seem extreme, about Ukraine, maybe we should be grateful that he is not speaking to President Putin. But I, for one, would strongly urge and publicly urge President Trump and his officials to put all that aside, and as a matter of first priority, as soon as President-elect Trump takes office, for him to call Putin right away, without any delay at all, to see how this whole situation can be brought back under some semblance of control. For the rest, let me repeat once again, the Russians continue to advance right across the contact line. There is no preventing that. There is no stopping it. The faster this is acknowledged and accepted, the better. Maybe some kind of negotiation can take place to find a resolution to this conflict. I'm becoming increasingly skeptical about this. But one way or the other, even if we cannot find a route to a diplomatic peace settlement, talks to contain this crisis at this time are essential. Well, let me now turn to the other topic that has been dominating the headlines over the last couple of hours, though I don't myself put them on anything like the same scale of importance as the situation that we're seeing unfold between Russia and the West and in Ukraine now. And I'm referring to the arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and the former Israeli Defense Minister, which have now been finally issued by the International Criminal Court. Now, I have to say, I was slightly surprised when these arrest warrants were issued. The chief prosecutor, had asked for these warrants some months ago, as I remember. The ICC itself, the judges there, seemed to be in no hurry to issue these warrants. In fact, I got the impression that they were slow walking them. Weeks passed, months passed. We've had situations where the ICC has refused to issue warrants requested by the chief prosecutor before. And there have been other situations, I understand, where the ICC has only issued warrants after delays amounting to something like 2 years. And given the extremely hostile reaction that there has been to this decision from Western governments, Germany, the United States, to some extent Britain and France, Hungary, where I am, has been very outspoken on this. I'm surprised that a court, mostly funded by the European states and based in The Hague, has come forward and made a decision like this. Now, this is, to put it mildly, deeply embarrassing for Western governments. For the Israeli government, I'm going to say it, I don't think it makes very much difference. The language and attitudes and conduct of senior Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Netanyahu himself, have struck a consistent note of defiance with respect both to the proceedings in the ICC and the parallel proceedings that are underway in the International Court of Justice, a completely different court, just to stress. I cannot imagine that Prime Minister Netanyahu would change his behavior or his language by this point. And he's confident now of support in the United States. He has no interest in changing his position. And frankly, I suspect that he calculates that in terms of Israeli domestic politics and his own electoral position in Israel, this ICC warrant works to his advantage. But European governments must be deeply embarrassed. They supported an arrest warrant against President Putin on, by the way, grounds that I find incomprehensible. And now they are presented with a warrant on, I would say, much stronger grounds against the Prime Minister of Israel, their ally. And one can sense the embarrassment, the squirming, the uncertainty about what to do. Germany is hinting that it would not enforce this warrant if Prime Minister Netanyahu were to visit Germany itself, even though Germany is obligated to enforce ICC warrants under the Rome Statute, and has previously said that it would do so. Hungary, by the way, Prime Minister Orban has openly said that Hungary would refuse to enforce such a warrant. So the European governments must be extremely angry and very embarrassed and very worried. But I get to say, they have to a great extent brought this whole situation upon themselves. Firstly, by supporting the court, the ICC, when it has brought problematic cases against various people around the world whom the West doesn't like, even in circumstances where I personally thought this was unwise. I'm choosing my words again very, very carefully. Apparently no one contemplated the possibility that the court might get out of control and start doing it to the West's own allies. At the same time, and I have to say this, and this goes to the reason why the court made this decision. The ultimate reason why the court made this decision is because global opinion has been running extremely strong about the situation in the Middle East. In Gaza, where a humanitarian catastrophe is underway, in Lebanon, and of course we've seen the various escalatory moves that have been taken by Israel over the last few months in Israel's confrontation with Iran. And I can't help but think that the judges at the ICC, probably very unwilling to make the decision they just have, felt that they had no alternative if the authority of the court were to continue to be respected around the world. The divergence between the treatment of Western adversaries and the protection accorded to Western allies is now becoming too great to conceal. And I suspect that behind the scenes, various countries around the world, principally Muslim countries, have simply been telling officials of the court that they will simply start to disapply the Rome Statute when it suits them if the court continues to go along the same route. So they have now issued the warrant. And that tells us how isolated the collective West has now become on the issues of Ukraine, obviously, but on the issue of the Middle East as well. The Western powers could have worked in good faith and hard to achieve a de-escalation of the crisis in the Middle East. That would not have involved compromising on any fundamental principle, on principles like the security of Israel, which is always being talked about, even on the question of Hamas and its actions. But they've never really exerted themselves in any serious way to stabilize the situation in the Middle East, to achieve genuine ceasefires there, to arrange for aid to be provided to the refugees and to the people of Gaza who are in a terrible crisis. They've never seriously attempted to do any of those things. And now we see legal processes that they have sworn to uphold on multiple occasions spiraling out of their control. I don't predict that I'm going to be devoting a huge amount of time to this case from this point onwards. I don't expect this warrant to be enforced against Prime Minister Netanyahu or Defence Minister Gallant. I don't seriously believe either of those two people ever to face trial in The Hague or anywhere else for any of the things that they have done or are accused of doing. But this episode again highlights the collapse of the international prestige and authority of the West. Now, the person who has explained all this, spoken about this best, is none other than Prime Minister Orban, the very man who, at the moment, has been acting to try to support or protect Prime Minister Netanyahu. But he has also spoken very wisely and very intelligently about the way in which the West currently appears to be losing its international authority. I'm going to quote from him, and I'm doing so, of course, partly because I'm in Budapest and I'm still obviously heavily influenced by the many things I have heard whilst I've been here. But this is what he said. After the collapse of communism, after the collapse of the USSR, the idea of the Western elite was that the world should be westernized, should be created in their own image and likeness. This is the idea of American exceptionalism, European arrogance and conceit, real or imaginary civilizational superiority, which has existed since the European Enlightenment. All this contributed to the fact that after 1990, the task became not the restoration of Eurasia, not a global agenda, not a world agenda, but westernization of the world along the lines on which the previously successful Western world had been built. We are here today because that era is over. The idea that the whole world should be organized along Western lines and that the people who would be chosen to do that would be willing to do it in exchange for economic, financial advantages has collapsed. Asian states have become stronger and have proved their ability to rise, exist and survive as independent economic and political powers. As a result, the center of the world economy has shifted to the East. Moreover, the Eastern economies are growing 4 times faster than the Western ones. Western industry creates 40% of the world's added value and Eastern industry 50%. This is the new reality. The Western world has not only failed in its idea and strategy of reorganizing the world, but is also suffocating in its own environment within the West. There are issues, and then he discusses various issues that the West has been involved in, and then he finishes the 500-year era of Western dominance is over. The century of Eurasia is coming. And it will not be easy for the West to realize that they are no longer the most beautiful and the most smart. Well, he is absolutely right. He's right about that in every respect. And I would add, in my opinion, this ICC decision, which he so strongly disagrees with, is a further symptom of that. one would like to think that at some point over the next few months, years maybe, some people in the West would recognize this. It is because they are refusing to do so that we are in the crisis in which we are. Why we see Russian missiles like the Oreshnik being used in the way that they are. Why there is now real possibility of attacks on Western military facilities in the West itself. Why we are closer to a global crisis and even a global war than we have ever been at any point, in my opinion, since certainly the Cuban Missile Crisis and arguably since the Second World War, and why our leaders in the West appear to be in collective denial about this fact and continue to engage in the flight from reality in which they are collectively participating. Either they change or we must change them. That's where I must finish my program today. Thank you for bearing with me whilst I have been in Budapest. There'll be more from me when I get back to London tomorrow. In the meantime, let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.